Zaria Cole stood on the rainy sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, her knuckles white as she gripped a soggy cardboard box containing the remains of her career. High above in the 40th floor glass tower, her former boss was likely pouring a celebratory scotch, having just fired Zaria after stealing the archival research she'd spent 6 months perfecting. With $0 in her bank account and a final notice for her family's community center tucked into her pocket, the cold New York rain felt like a funeral shroud. She was invisible, just another girl in a damp cardigan being swallowed by the city's indifferent fog. But as the traffic lights flickered to red, a black armored SUV pulled to the curb with predatory precision. The window rolled down to reveal Dorian Salvatti, a man whose sharp jawline and ink-stained neck were as legendary as his lethal reputation. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a terrifying, absolute focus. He wasn't there to offer a hand up. He was there because Zaria was the only person alive who held the key to his empire's darkest secrets. Before this night ends, Zaria will learn that when a monster offers you a lifeline, it's because he knows you're the only one brave enough to pull him out of the dark. The heavy door of the SUV clicked shut, sealing out the roar of the rain and replacing it with the scent of expensive leather and cold minerals. Zaria sat stiffly, her damp cardigan pressing against the pristine upholstery, as Dorian Salvatti signaled the driver with a nearly imperceptible nod. He didn't speak immediately. He simply watched her, his thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. As the vehicle glided through the iron gates of a sprawling estate in Pacific Heights, Zaria felt the sheer scale of the world she was being pulled into. The mansion was a monolith of stone and shadow, tucked behind hedges so tall they blocked out the rest of San Francisco. When the car stopped, Dorian finally leaned forward, his tattoos disappearing beneath the crisp collar of his white shirt. He slid a single sheet of heavy vellum across the console. It wasn't a standard employment contract. It was a declaration of intent. Zaria's eyes blurred as she reached the figure at the bottom of the page. It wasn't just a salary. It was an amount that could pay off the community service debt in a single month and still leave her wealthy. Her breath hitched. It was the kind of money that bought more than labor. It bought lives. "You're an archivist, Zaria," Dorian said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the small space. "You understand that some things are too precious to be left in the wrong hands. Your mind is one of those things." "I don't understand," she whispered. "You could hire anyone. Why me? Why a girl who just got fired from a firm that didn't even know her name?" "Because the firm is run by idiots who look at the cover and never the text," he countered, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "I've spent months watching you preserve that crumbling center. I know you can see patterns where others see chaos, and I need those eyes on my family's history." He paused, and the air in the car seemed to thin. "But there's a clause. Look at the bottom." Zaria scanned the fine print. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she read the words mandatory on-site residency. "You want me to live here?" "I don't want you to, Zaria. You have to," Dorian said, his expression shifting from businesslike to something darker, something almost protective. "The moment you sign that paper and walk through my front door, you aren't just an employee. You become a target for every person who wants what's in my vaults. I'm not paying you for your time. I'm paying for your safety. You stay under my roof, under my protection, or the deal is off." Zaria looked out the window at the looming mansion, then back at the man who was offering her a throne and a cage all at once. She thought of her empty bank account, her uncle's predatory smile, and the final notice burning a hole in her pocket. She realized that Dorian Salvatti wasn't just offering her a job. He was offering her the chance to stop being the victim in someone else's story. With a hand that only trembled slightly, she reached for the gold-plated pen he held out. She wasn't just signing a contract, she was stepping into the lion's den, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she might actually belong there. The bronze-accented elevator descended far past the mansion's marble foyer, past the wine cellar, and deep into the literal bedrock of the estate. Zaria watched the floor numbers disappear until the doors slid open with a heavy, pressurized hiss. She expected a cold concrete bunker. Instead, she stepped into a cathedral of mahogany and climate-controlled glass. The room was vast, smelling of aged parchment and beeswax. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of volumes, but Dorian didn't lead her to the center of the room. He walked toward a reinforced steel door at the very back, keyed in a complex biometric code, and ushered her into a smaller, dimly lit sanctuary. On a central velvet-topped table sat a row of weathered, leather-bound ledgers. Zaria's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to touch them to recognize the gold-embossed C on the spines. These were the legendary Cole family records, archives that had allegedly been lost in a fire back in 1924, taking her family's prestige and history with them. "You said you had your family's history," Dorian said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I wasn't talking about the community center. I was talking about these. I've spent 10 years and millions of dollars hunting them down." Zaria moved toward the table as if in a trance, her fingers hovering just inches above the cracked leather. "The Great Fire. My grandfather always said someone stole them before the matches were even lit. He was called a crazy old man for believing it." "He wasn't crazy, he was right," Dorian replied, stepping into the light. The shadows of the room emphasized the sharpness of his features, making him look less like a businessman and more like a guardian of the dead. "My ancestors were the muscles area. But yours? Your ancestors were the brains. They were the architects of the city's underground. Every bribe, every hidden tunnel, every secret alliance, it was all recorded by the Coles, and they did it in a cipher that has baffled every cryptographer I've hired." He picked up the smallest ledger, handling it with a reverence that surprised her. "The Salvatti Empire is built on a foundation of sand because we lost the maps. There are rival families moving in, claiming territory they don't own, and I have no way to prove they're lying without these, but there's a catch." He opened the book and turned it toward her. The pages were filled with what looked like beautiful, flowing calligraphy, interspersed with complex geometric sketches and musical notation. To a casual observer, it looked like a madman's diary. "It's an archivist's cipher," Zaria whispered, her eyes widening as she recognized a specific pattern in the margins, a shorthand used only by elite black scholars in the early 20th century. "It's not just a code, it's a layered narrative. You have to know the history of the streets to know which letters to skip." Dorian leaned over the table, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "Exactly. You have the mass communications degree, the archival training, and more importantly, you have the blood. You know the stories your grandfather told. You know the rhythm of this city." Zaria looked from the ledgers to Dorian, the shock finally settling into a cold, hard realization. "You didn't hire me to be your assistant. You hired me to be your key." "I hired you because you're the only person on Earth who can read the truth," Dorian corrected, his eyes burning with an intensity that left her speechless. "Save your family's legacy by reading mine. Crack this code, and I'll give you the world. Fail, and we both disappear." The transition from the basement's quiet dust to the chaotic reality of Dorian's world happened on a Tuesday morning. Zaria had been cooped up for 72 hours, her mind swimming in 1920s shorthand and ink-stained maps, when the walls of the mansion began to feel like a velvet-lined coffin. She needed air, and more importantly, she needed a specific grade of archival solvent only found in a small specialty shop in the Mission District. Dorian had resisted, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the rain-slicked streets on the security monitors, but eventually he relented. He didn't send her with a driver. He drove her himself, in a nondescript black sedan that felt like a rolling fortress. The shop was tucked into an alleyway, a relic of old San Francisco. Zaria had just stepped back onto the sidewalk, clutching a small brown bag of supplies, when the atmosphere shifted. The city's ambient noise, the distant hum of traffic and the cry of gulls, cut out, replaced by the screech of tires. A silver van veered into the mouth of the alley, blocking their exit, while a second vehicle swerved in behind them. Before Zaria could even gasp, 4 men in tactical gear spilled out. They didn't have the polished look of Dorian's security. They were jagged, desperate, and armed with heavy-grade zip ties and sedative dart guns. They weren't there to kill Dorian. They were there to snatch his key. "Get in the car, Zaria, now," Dorian commanded. His voice wasn't panicked. It was terrifyingly flat. Instead of retreating, Dorian stepped into the space between Zaria and the lead kidnapper. One of the men lunged, a serrated blade flashing in the dull afternoon light. Dorian didn't flinch. In a blur of motion that Zaria's eyes could barely track, he intercepted the man's wrist. The sound of bone snapping echoed like a pistol shot in the narrow alley.
Dorian didn't stop. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of the endgame. He disarmed the second man with a brutal strike to the throat, and used the third as a human shield against a fourth who had pulled a firearm. The air smelled of burnt rubber and copper. Zaria leaned against the sedan, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had seen Dorian as an intense, mysterious employer, but watching him now was like watching a natural disaster in a tailored suit. He was efficient, lethal, and utterly devoid of mercy. As the last man collapsed to the pavement, Dorian didn't check his own pulse or straighten his tie. He turned to Zaria, his eyes scanning her from head to toe for a single scratch. The rage that had fueled his movements vanished, replaced by an unnerving, singular focus on her safety. He reached out, his hand, still stained with the blood of the men who had tried to touch her, hovering just an inch from her shoulder. "Did they touch you?" he rasped, his breath coming in steady, controlled bursts. Zaria looked at the carnage in the alley, then back at Dorian. She should have been repulsed. She should have run. But as she looked into his dark, uncompromising eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. The world outside this sedan was a place where she was a pawn to be snatched and sold. Inside Dorian's shadow, she was the only thing that mattered. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "They didn't get close." Dorian nodded, a dark satisfaction flickering in his gaze. He opened the passenger door, ushering her back into the safety of the ironclad interior. As they sped away, leaving the silver van behind, Zaria realized she wasn't just working for the most dangerous man in the city. She was being kept by him. And for the first time, the protection clause in her contract didn't feel like a restriction. It felt like a warning to the rest of the world. The adrenaline from the alleyway attack hadn't fully ebbed when Dorian led Zaria into the security hub of the estate. The room was bathed in the cold, flickering blue light of a dozen monitors, a stark contrast to the warm, leather-scented sanctuary of the archives. Dorian's expression was a mask of stone as he leaned over the shoulder of his lead tech, a man whose fingers danced across a keyboard with frantic speed. "Run the plates on the silver van again," Dorian commanded, "and I want the burner phone logs from the lead snatcher." Someone fed them her location the second she stepped out of the mansion. Zaria stood by the door, her hands still trembling as she clutched her bag of archival supplies. She felt like an intruder in this high-tech war room, a girl caught in a crossfire she didn't understand. But as the tech pulled up a decrypted message thread, a familiar name flashed on the screen. "Marcus Cole," the tech whispered, glancing nervously at Dorian. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Zaria stepped forward, her heart sinking into her stomach. "My Uncle Marcus?" Dorian moved aside, allowing her to see the screen. It was an encrypted chat log, dated just 3 hours ago. The messages were clinical, a business transaction written in the blood of family. Marcus had provided Zaria's exact schedule, the shop address, and even a description of her outfit. In exchange, he had been promised a massive consultation fee and a guaranteed seat on the board of the development firm that was currently trying to bulldoze the community center. "He didn't just tip them off," Dorian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating register. "He was selling you to my rivals as a bargaining chip. He knew they wanted the ledgers, and he figured if they had you, they could force me to hand them over. He'd get his center sold, his debt cleared, and you'd be the collateral damage." Zaria stared at the screen, the blue light stinging her eyes. She thought of the Sunday dinners at Marcus's house, the way he had patted her hand and told her she was the only hope for the family legacy. She realized now that every tear he'd shed over the center's foreclosure had been a performance. He hadn't been mourning their history, he had been price tagging it. "He told me he loved that building," Zaria whispered, the betrayal tasting like ash in her mouth. "He told me I was the only one he could trust to save it." "He was using your loyalty as a leash, Zaria," Dorian said, stepping into her space. He didn't offer a platitude or a comforting hug. He simply placed a firm hand on the back of her chair, a solid anchor in her crumbling world. "Men like Marcus don't value history. He saw you as a way to get paid twice. Once by the city for the land, and once by my enemies for your life." The shock was rapidly being replaced by a cold, sharpened rage. Zaria looked at the decrypted logs, then up at Dorian. For weeks she had been afraid of his world, afraid of the violence and the shadows. But as she realized that her own flesh and blood had been the one to throw her to the wolves,
The man standing beside her didn't look like a monster anymore. He looked like the only truth she had left. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice regaining its strength. Dorian's eyes darkened, a predatory glint reflecting the monitors. "Now, we let him think he's winning. You go back to those ledgers. You find the proof we need to bury the developers and your uncle along with them. I'll handle the security." He leaned closer, his gaze locked on hers. "No one survives a betrayal in this house, Zaria. Not even family." The moon hung low over the estate, casting long skeletal shadows across the archive floor as Zaria worked by the dim glow of a banker's lamp. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering chill of betrayal. She didn't hear Dorian enter. She simply felt the temperature in the room shift, the atmosphere growing heavy with his presence. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket, and the sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up, revealing the intricate tattoos that crawled like vines up his forearms. "You're staring at the 1922 census records again," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. He didn't move toward the table, instead leaning against a mahogany pillar in the shadows. "You won't find the answer in the numbers, Zaria. You'll find it in the gaps between them." Zaria rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. "My uncle told me we were nobodies, that the Coles were just janitors and laborers who got lucky with a community center. But these ledgers, they're a map of the city's soul. Why do you care so much, Dorian? A man like you doesn't spend a decade chasing ghost stories just for a better land deed." Dorian stepped into the circle of light, the glow catching the hard planes of his face. For the first time, the predatory mask slipped, revealing a weariness that matched her own. "There is a war coming. 3 families believe they have a claim to the docks, and they're willing to burn this city to the ground to prove it. But there was a pact made a century ago, a blood accord, signed by the founding fathers of the underground and witnessed by a Cole. That ledger is the only thing that can stop the slaughter. It's the only law they still fear." He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. "But that isn't the only reason I hunted these down. I didn't find you by accident, Zaria, and I didn't start watching you the day you were fired." Zaria felt the breath leave her lungs. "What are you saying? Who do you think paid for your mother's experimental treatments 10 years ago?" he asked softly, his voice a low rasp. "Who do you think blocked the first 3 attempts to seize that community center before you were even old enough to vote? It wasn't the city's kindness, and it certainly wasn't your Uncle Marcus." Zaria stumbled back, her hand catching the edge of the velvet-topped table. "You? But I didn't even know you existed. We were drowning, and someone, an anonymous donor, just appeared. Why?" "Because my father was the one who survived the fire in 1924, and it was your great-grandfather who pulled him out of the flames," Dorian confessed, his eyes darkening with a century of debt. "The Salvattis owe the Coles a blood debt that can never be fully repaid. I've been the ghost in your machine for a decade, Zaria. I've been protecting your family from the shadows because it was the only way to keep the wolves away while I searched for these books." He reached out, his fingers brushing the gold-embossed C on the ledger between them. "I needed you to be the key, yes, but I also needed you to be safe. I brought you here to finish what your ancestors started, not as a victim of your uncle's greed, but as the master of your own history. I've been your shield for years, Zaria. Now, I need you to be my partner." Zaria looked at the man the world called a monster, realizing that every struggle she thought she had faced alone was actually a battle he had been fighting beside her. The speechless shock wasn't from the secret of the ledger, but from the realization that in a world full of predators, the most dangerous one had been her guardian all along. The weight of Dorian's confession hung in the air, but Zaria couldn't let the emotion drown her. She had to find the truth hidden in the ink. She turned back to the ledgers, her vision tunneling as the numbers and symbols began to vibrate under the lamp's yellow glow. For hours, she had treated the text like a puzzle of logic. But as she hummed the melody of a song her grandfather used to sing, the one about the river that flows beneath the street, the patterns shifted. The musical notation in the margins wasn't meant to be played. It was meant to be measured. "It's not a cipher, Dorian," she whispered, her voice cracking the silence of the vault. He was instantly at her side, his presence a silent shadow. "I was looking for words, but your ancestors and mine were more clever than that. They didn't write down the secrets, they hid the coordinates." She grabbed a sheet of vellum and began to overlay the geometric sketches onto a 1920s map of the city. The lines didn't follow the grid of the modern streets. Instead, they traced the old trolley lines and the long-buried culverts of the waterfront. The shorthand she had recognized earlier wasn't a language at all. It was a series of depths and degrees. As she plotted the points, a shape began to emerge, cutting right through the heart of the district where the community center stood. "The center isn't just a building," Zaria said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's a landmark. The original deeds aren't at City Hall. They never were. That's why the foreclosure keeps moving forward. The city is working off records that were intentionally falsified a century ago to protect the true ownership." She pointed to a specific intersection on the map, a place where the old city's brickwork met the new concrete. "There's a dead space here, a subterranean vault beneath the foundation of the center. My great-grandfather didn't just witness the blood accord. He built the safe where it was stored. The original land grants, the ones that grant the Cole family permanent sovereignty over that soil, bypassing any municipal seizure, are buried there." Dorian leaned in close, the scent of cedar and cold steel surrounding her. His eyes scanned the coordinates she had mapped out. "If those deeds exist, the city's foreclosure isn't just a mistake. It's an act of war against a sovereign title. Your Uncle Marcus isn't just selling a building. He's trying to sell land the city has no legal right to touch." Zaria felt a surge of cold, academic triumph. For years, she had felt like a tenant in her own life, a girl struggling to pay rent on a history she didn't fully own. But the code had finally cracked open. She wasn't a victim of a system. She was the holder of a title that the system couldn't erase. "We have to go there," she said, looking up at Dorian. "If Marcus or the developers find that vault first, they won't just take the land. They'll burn the proof that we ever existed." Dorian straightened, his face hardening into the lethal mask of the Iron Duke. "They won't get the chance. You found the map, Zaria. Now I'll provide the army. We move tonight. The city will realize they haven't been fighting a struggling archivist. They've been trying to rob a queen." The transformation was complete, but it felt more like an awakening. Zaria stood before the full-length mirror in the Salvatti suite, draped in a gown of midnight silk that clung to her like liquid shadow. Dorian stepped up behind her, his reflection a sharp contrast in a tailored tuxedo that hid the lethal intent beneath. He didn't offer a necklace of diamonds. Instead, he handed her a slim, reinforced leather portfolio containing the decoded proofs they had recovered from the vault. "Tonight, they expect a girl who was broken by the rain," Dorian murmured, his hand resting briefly on the small of her back. "Show them the woman who owns the ground they're standing on." The grand ballroom of the plaza was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles, a gathering of the city's most powerful wolves, all toasted by the very city council members who had signed the papers to erase Zaria's history. As they entered, the room didn't just go quiet. The Iron Duke was a known terror, but the woman on his arm, standing with her chin high and eyes like sharpened flint, was a variable they hadn't calculated. Zaria spotted them near the center of the floor, Councilman Holloway and her Uncle Marcus, looking smug in a rented suit, surrounded by the lead developers. They were laughing, likely celebrating the finalization of the foreclosure. Zaria didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for an introduction. She walked straight into the center of their circle, the silk of her gown whispering a warning. "Councilman," Zaria said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the ambient hum of the string quartet. Holloway turned, a patronizing smile forming. "Ah, Miss Cole, I see you've found a patron, but I'm afraid the matter of the community center is settled. The city has moved forward." "The city moved forward on a lie," Zaria countered. She opened the portfolio, pulling out the high-resolution scans of the original 1924 deeds. "This is a sovereign land grant, predating the municipal charter of this district. It carries a perpetual trust clause that prohibits seizure, sale, or transfer without the unanimous consent of the Cole bloodline." Marcus stepped forward, his face paling to a sickly gray. "Zaria, don't be foolish. Those are old papers. They mean everything, Marcus," she snapped, her gaze turning to ice. "They mean that every contract you've signed with these developers is fraudulent. They mean that the city council has been attempting to sell property that was never theirs to claim." Dorian stepped into the light behind her, his presence looming like a dark cloud over the assembly. He didn't say a word, but the way his hand rested near his jacket, the silent promise of the Salvatti family's reach, ensured that no one moved to stop her. "I'm not here to negotiate," Zaria told the stunned councilman, her voice echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling. "I'm here to serve notice. You have 48 hours to rescind the foreclosure and issue a public apology to my family, or these documents, and the records of the bribes you took to ignore them, will be on the desk of every federal prosecutor by morning." The wolves were silent now, their teeth hidden. Zaria looked at her uncle, seeing him for the small, desperate man he truly was. She realized then that she didn't need Dorian to save her. She needed him to stand as a witness while she saved herself. She had walked into the gala as a struggling archivist, but as she turned her back on the broken circle of powerful men, she walked out as the woman who had just brought the city to its knees. The aftermath of the gala felt like the quiet before a landslide. Zaria retreated to the cool, dimly lit corridor of the plaza, her heart still thrumming with the high of the confrontation. But the shadows of the velvet curtains shifted, and Uncle Marcus stepped out, his tuxedo disheveled, and his face twisted into a mask of desperate malice. The smugness was gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a man who saw his life's work and his safety vanishing into the dark. "You think you've won, Zaria?" he hissed, stepping into her path. He looked around frantically, ensuring they were momentarily alone. "You've ruined everything. Those developers, they don't just sue people, they make people disappear. You've put a target on the back of every Cole left in the city." Zaria didn't flinch. "I didn't put the target there, Marcus. You did. The moment you traded our blood for a board seat, you became the only threat to this family." "I was trying to save us from poverty," Marcus snarled, his voice rising to a cracked, jagged edge. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers fumbling with something metallic. "I won't let a 26-year-old girl with a soggy box of books burn my future. Give me that portfolio, now." He lunged forward, his hand emerging with a small, snub-nosed pistol, the weapon of a coward who had run out of lies. Zaria's breath caught, her back hitting the cold stone wall, but before Marcus could even level the barrel, the air in the hallway seemed to scream. Dorian didn't walk into the corridor. He materialized. In a movement so fluid it was almost beautiful, Dorian's hand clamped onto Marcus's wrist like a hydraulic press. There was a sickening, wet crunch as the bone gave way. Marcus let out a strangled shriek, the gun clattering harmlessly to the carpet, but Dorian didn't let go. He spun Marcus around, slamming him against the marble wall with enough force to rattle the crystal sconces. Dorian's face was closer to a gargoyle's than a man's now, devoid of empathy, radiating a cold, predatory heat. He didn't look at Marcus. His eyes were fixed on the gun on the floor, then back to Zaria to ensure she was untouched. "You made a mistake, Marcus," Dorian said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that made the hair on Zaria's neck stand up. "You thought I hired her to do my filing. You thought she was just a girl you could bully because she was broke." Dorian leaned in, his sharp jawline inches from Marcus's terrified face. "She isn't just an employee. She is the ward of the Salvatti house, and in this city, that means she is untouchable. You didn't just try to silence a niece, you tried to damage the Iron Duke's interest, and for that, there is no negotiation." Marcus blubbered, his eyes wide and leaking tears of pain. "Dorian, please, she's my family." "Family is a bond of loyalty, not a coincidence of birth," Dorian countered, his grip tightening until Marcus's face turned a bruised purple. "You broke that bond. Now you'll watch from a prison cell as she builds the empire you were too small to imagine." Dorian stepped back, signaling the two silent shadows that appeared at the end of the hall to drag Marcus away. He didn't look back at the man who had shared Zaria's blood. He turned to her, his expression softening just enough to reveal the guardian beneath the monster. He reached out, his hand steady and warm, as it brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "The shield is holding, Zaria," he murmured. "Are you ready to finish this?" Zaria looked down the hall, where her past was being hauled away in handcuffs, then back at the man who had stood between her and a bullet. She nodded, her fear replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The betrayal was exposed, the dead weight was gone, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just safe, she was free. The scaffolding had finally come down, revealing the restored red brick and polished limestone of the Cole Community Center. It stood as a defiant sentinel against the skyline of glass and steel, no longer a crumbling relic of the past, but a designated historical landmark that had once threatened Zaria's sanity was now framed in the lobby, a reminder of the fire she had walked through to get here. Zaria stood on the roof of the center, the evening breeze pulling at her hair as she looked out over the city. Below, the streets were alive with the rhythm of people who finally had a place to belong. The foreclosure was dead, the developers had retreated into the shadows of litigation, and Uncle Marcus was a name spoken only in legal depositions. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste like anxiety. A steady, familiar footfall echoed on the gravel behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was Dorian. He didn't come to her with the predatory intensity of the Iron Duke, but with the quiet, grounded presence of the man who had stayed awake with her through the long nights of decoding. The city council signed the final preservation easement an hour ago, Dorian said, his voice a low vibration in the pool air. He stopped beside her, leaning his elbows on the stone parapet. He wasn't looking at the view, he was looking at her. The Coles are officially untouchable. Zaria smiled, a genuine, weary expression of triumph. We did it. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I think the floor is finally solid. It's solid because you built it, Dorian countered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a new document. Not a contract for residency or a predatory loan, but a partnership agreement for a new archival foundation. I have more vaults, Zaria. More histories that have been buried by men who wanted to rewrite the world. I don't need an assistant to file them. I need a partner to lead the search. Zaria looked at the paper, then up at the man who had spent a decade protecting her family from the dark. Throughout her life, people had seen her as a worker, a daughter, or a strong one to be leaned on, until she broke. Even her own blood had seen her as a commodity to be sold. But as she looked into Dorian's eyes, she saw the reflection of her own intellect, her own tenacity, and her own worth. He didn't want to save her. He wanted to stand beside her. You're offering me a job again, she noted, a hint of wit touching her voice. I'm offering you a seat at the table, Dorian corrected, his hand settling over hers on the parapet. His touch was warm, certain, and devoid of the control he exerted over the rest of the world. I'm offering you a life where your mind is the most dangerous weapon in the room, and I'm the one lucky enough to watch you use it. Zaria felt the last of her hyper-independence melt away, replaced by the realization that she didn't have to carry the legacy alone. She reached for the pen, but before she signed, she squeezed his hand. She had started this journey with a soggy box and a broken heart, believing she was a girl who had lost everything. But as the sun set over the city she had reclaimed, Zaria Cole realized she hadn't just saved her family's past. She had found a future where she was finally, undeniably, seen. Zaria's journey from the rain-soaked sidewalk to the heights of her own empire proves that when you own your history, no one can take your future. Dorian didn't just give her a job. He gave her the world she was always meant to lead. How do you feel about Zaria's massive transformation and Dorian's secret protection? If you loved this story of justice and legacy, let us know. Drop your country in the comments, hit that like button, and share this video with someone who needs to see their own worth today.